Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I was struck this morning, even more forcibly than normal, about how different the debate in Sweden is to the United Kingdom. And I must apologise that many of the issues and problems I'll probably be addressing today, to some extent, are not necessarily at the forefront of the problems in Sweden, which is often the model that we might take for inclusive labour markets and for social and protection and employment rights. Okay, so in that context, I'm going to be talking this morning, or this afternoon, sorry, lunch is a bit earlier here than in England. This would still be before lunch. About inclusive labour markets and precarious employment, challenges and contradictions. And I'm drawing on, to some extent, on a project we did on precarious work in 6 European countries, not including Sweden. It did include Denmark, but many, I won't go through the details. I'll mention the countries when appropriate. So, we all know that the standard employment relationship is to some extent in peril. And the question really I'm looking at today is precarious employment becoming the new norm? The standard employment relationship is in danger. It's in danger in three ways. There's a risk of extinction. Some authors suggest that it's declining and will disappear. Perhaps a more important risk is the risk of what I call hollowing out, whereby the standard employment relationship no longer provides the protections that we associate with it. And finally, there's a risk of exclusivity, that only some people will have access, and this would create polarization. And there is indeed a consensus that we might expect a continuous expansion of precarious employment associated with the non-standard forms of employment that we see in all countries, and indeed the hollowing out of the standard employment relationship, which might be considered a kind of further expansion of precarious work. But the question is, how should policymakers respond to this growth of precarious work? Now, in the paper on which this talk is based, I identify 4 main strands of the debate on how to respond to precarious work. The first one, I'm not really going to spend too much time on because it's really not my own focus and it's well researched and discussed, and that's the, if you like, the neoclassical, the neoliberal agenda that actually the growth of precarious work is a reflection of too high protection for a privileged group of insiders, and that the only answer, therefore, is to lower protection for core workers. That argument is still made in the UK, even though we have much, much lower protection than in Sweden. So in some senses, it makes no sense to carry on discussing that. A second argument, which I will be drawing on, is to protect the standard employment relationship through reforming the standard employment relationship. The argument here is that we need to change the form while maintaining the substance of the decommodification of labour, that is, reducing the extent to which labour is subject to the market forces and the insecurity and risk associated with that. And I'll be coming back to that extensively. But alongside those 2 main debates, there's also the activation agenda, where there's a concern that the growth of non-standard employment runs the risk of creating long-term unemployed, because it's difficult to some extent for the unemployed to take precarious jobs. And this has problems of both social exclusion for some analysts and a problem of not disciplining the workforce, allowing long-term unemployment for others. And so there's an agenda from activation about how can we actually deal with the labour market when a lot of the new jobs available are non-standard or precarious. And finally, there's a big debate about whether, if the standard employment relationship is no longer fit for purpose, should we be adopting universal social protection, a universal basic income, and abandoning employment protection and welfare state conditionality as we know it? So these are going to be underlying some of the discussion today. Now, precarious work, or to some extent, almost by definition, is recommodifying labour. And it's likely to be intensified to the extent we have policies that require take-up of precarious jobs for those who are unemployed. I think decommodification of labour has been associated more with social protection and the arguments of Esping Anderson's work. But I think we need to recognise how far the standard employment relationship has done a large part of the job. This has not necessarily been done voluntarily by employers, but also under mandatory requirements from the state and through collective bargaining, depending on the country. And this has led to open-ended contracts that provide security, decent and guaranteed wages, and importantly, support for over non-work periods of holidays, sickness, and indeed even contributions to pensions. And alongside that, there's this role of the state that is providing mandated rights that have to be activated by employers, but also providing social protection. So in response to the growth of precarious work, we have to think about what are the policy options. Well, first of all, there can be no action, if you like, and an acceptance of the growth of recommodification of labour. Alternatively, we can think about extending standard employment relationship protections to those in non-standard forms of employment. Thirdly, we can talk about flexibilising the standard employment relationship to enable the take-up and retention of standard employment relationship type employment by those groups who may have been excluded through the form in which standard employment relationship is organised. And finally, we can think of substituting state-based decommodification of precarious work through, and this is very important in my own country, through in-work benefits. However, we must remember that this is only partial substitution. Only those who are in low-income households are often eligible for subsidies from the state. Or alternatively, we can think about the universal social protection, universal basic income. So one of the big agendas is whether or not state-based decommodification of precarious work is the answer. And it's obviously, in a way, part of the solution addressing the working poor, but also part of the problem, because you can argue that it normalises and legitimises through supporting precarious work, and therefore makes its spread easier for employers and for to pursue. So, I'm going to develop my argument in 3 stages. Firstly, I'm going to carry on with this debate by using a new framework, which I've called SOFL, which I'll explain in a minute, to explain why there is a need for both the extension and the flexibilisation of the standard employment relationship. Secondly, I'm going to look a little bit more detail about how precarious work is being repositioned as an acceptable and required alternative to unemployment to promote activation. And finally, and probably, if you like, the most substantive part, I'm going to look at 4 alternative approaches to reform of employment and social protection. The SOFL framework is as follows. I'm suggesting that in order to make sense of these conundrums, we need to think about what do we actually want from employment? And I've come up with these 4 ideas. First of all, people need security. They need security of a wage, security of a job, and income for non-work times. They need the opportunity to develop and use their talents to progress in the labour market. They need fair treatment at work, fairness, transparency, due process, and opportunities for voice. And finally, they need the opportunity to have life beyond work, the opportunity to care and to pursue personal interests, and indeed to stop work. Now, using that framework, I've then compared what the standard employment relationship provides, what the problems are for those in precarious work, and what the policy approach could be. It's fairly obvious that precarious work doesn't provide the same kind of income security and guaranteed job and social protection. So one issue is to extend those protections to those in non-standard forms of employment and therefore reduce precarious work. Another problem is opportunity. a long-term open-ended employment contract provides a platform through which employers can invest in their workforce. Those in non-standard forms of employment are often excluded from that training and opportunity for progression, partly because of insecurity of duration or shorter hours, which mean employers don't think it's worthwhile investing. So we need to find ways both to enable more people to stay within the standard employment relationship, provide second chances, and also to extend training and opportunities for those not in a standard employment relationship. Fair treatment is another problem because often those in non-standard forms of employment do not have an opportunity to voice grievances, even if they are unfairly treated. And we need to find ways in which we can deal with that. That may be some kind of extensions of rights to those in non-standard forms of employment, but importantly, I think, joint responsibility between clients and subcontractors for fairness and treatment in work. And then there's life beyond work. Now, here the standard employment relationship has kind of failed because although it has a division between work and non-work time, that doesn't mesh necessarily with people's actual non-work commitments. And this has caused people to feel excluded from the standard employment relationship. In my own country, often having to accept, if you like, a 0 hours contract in return for rights to work flexibly or part-time. So we need ways in which we can flexibilise the standard employment relationship and extend the non-work and non-work time divide to protect more workers and to enable more workers to stay in their career jobs within a standard employment relationship, even when they have a period of intensified non-work commitments. So this sort of, if you like, summarises what I've just said, that we need to extend SER conditions through both employer action and state action to include non-standard forms of employment and unpaid care workers as well, to adjust and compensate for non-standard forms of employment characteristics, and to provide high minimum employment standards and minimum social protection so that people who are not in high wage or secure employment do at least have access to protection that is based on what an adult requires. And on the other side, we need to flexibilise access, and this is really down to the employer, more flexibility recruitment into standard employment relationships so that flexible working at the point of recruitment is standard, opportunities within employment for more leave and flexible working, and importantly, and this doesn't apply in any of the 6 countries I was looking at, rights to carry over rights to flexible working from one employer to the other so as to stop entrapment with the current employer, because most countries require you to have worked first for the employer before you have a right to either work flexibly or right to request to work flexibly. So that's an explanation of the SOFL approach. That's informing my sort of comments through the talk about what works and what might not work. Another part of the story is this construction of precarious work as an acceptable or required alternative to unemployment. It's actually interesting that this growth of precarious work is throwing into question what is unemployment. In order to talk about somebody unemployed, we need to know what it is to have a job, to what it is to be employed. And in 3 of the countries we were studying, the UK, Germany and France, to some extent that division between being employed and unemployed is being blurred because of a blurring of unemployment benefits and in-work benefits. This has been taken to an extreme in the UK with a new benefit being brought in called universal credit that gets rid of unemployment benefits and in-work benefits and puts everybody in the same benefit system. So I think this is a real challenge to the way in which we think about labour markets and social protection. All the 6 countries were doing something to enable people who were unemployed to work in more flexible jobs. They may be drawing down some of their unemployment benefit to partially support themselves, or they may have more opportunities to work for longer and earn more while claiming unemployment benefit. But as I said, the UK, France and Germany were taking this to more extremes of actually really blurring this divide. And that's just a summary of that. I'm rushing through this a little bit because I need to get to the third part of the talk. But I think this is an issue that is becoming really problematic because it does involve in all those three countries, more state support being provided to employers who are only offering precarious jobs to workers. And I'll be coming back to that in this third stage as well. So, this final part of my talk, I want to look at options for extending employment and social protection. And I've come up with 4 options that all draw on some of the things I've already been talking about. The first is to reform policies to extend the eligibility and the value of rights and benefits within the existence to more people who are currently in non-standard forms of employment or various forms of precarious work. The second is to reduce non-standard forms of employment, in part by developing policies to ease the retention or re-entry to standard employment relationships. The third is to restrict the impact of non-standard forms of employment precarious work by providing in-work benefits for the low-paid. And the fourth is to revolutionise social protection by disconnecting it from employment status and implementing universal basic income. So, looking first at the reform aspects, what we found in the project, and I haven't got time to go into detail, was there were examples where countries were reducing or abolishing thresholds that had restricted the contributions that people could make to social protection or their eligibility for benefits. And I think I'll just give you one example. In France, instead of having to work 200 hours at the equivalent of the minimum wage in 3 months for that quarter to count towards social protection, that had been reduced to 150 hours. That brings in more people into the social protection system. So I'm just going to give you snapshots. Another thing is to provide minimum protection needs for adult citizens. And all countries, once you've met the eligibility to get benefits, did provide a high minimum social benefit that was then reflective of, if you like, the needs of an adult, independent of whether they've been working part-time, flexibly, long periods out of unemployment. The only exception here was Germany, that still maintained a very strict relationship between how much you paid into the social protection system and how much you got out. Another way of helping is to extend these rights to the self-employed. Again, 5 of the 6 countries, again, the exception being Germany, although that may be changing now in Germany, required the self-employed to join the pension system. But only 3 gave maternity leave, paid maternity leave to those who are self-employed. So there's options there. Some were compensating for the insecurity of being in non-standard forms of employment. For example, Spain and France gave higher redundancy pay for those in temporary contracts. And others, in fact all, were compensating for reasons for people being in less well-paid or curtailed employment. For example, through care credits in the pension system, although these care credits varied dramatically between countries. So there's lots of things that we can learn from in different countries as to how we could extend the SER. Then we looked at reducing the extent of precarious work through flexibilising the standard employment relationship to enable those to remain in their jobs and pursue their careers. And obviously maternity leave has been one of the major factors here that has enabled people to return to work. And all 6 countries had either the right to work flexibly or the right to request flexible working after return to work. However, the rights to return to full-time working later, when your care needs may change, were only really present in a strong form in Slovenia. As I've already suggested, people are trapped through this rights to flexible working with their current employer and cannot necessarily transfer it to another employer and therefore get stuck on a mommy track, which means that they cannot necessarily progress their career. And even worse, I think, was that there were few second chances provided for people wanting to enter SER employment type later in their careers. I think age discrimination legislation, unless is weakly enforced in most countries, you may be able to tell me it's different in Sweden. And the unemployed in the UK, for example, if they want to study, lose their benefits. In Denmark, which is probably more similar to Sweden, people could use their unemployment benefits to support themselves studying. So this opportunity for second chances also needs to be developed. Then we come to the restricting the impact of non-standard forms of employment through in-work benefit. This is aimed at addressing the problem of the working poor and providing opportunities for those who are unemployed to actually access jobs, given that many of the jobs are precarious jobs. However, and I've already said that UK, France and Germany are doing this with the in-work benefits, and all countries providing greater opportunities for the unemployed to work and claim benefits. Now, what I want to focus on here is some of the contradictions of the in-work benefits. There are subsidies to employers providing low pay and irregular employment. And in some countries, my own particularly, that's actually in addition to actually excluding them from having to contribute to social security. In Germany, on the mini-jobs, employers have to pay 30% to the social security, even though the employees don't have to contribute. In the UK, employers who offer low-wage jobs are entirely excluded from having to make contributions to social security. It also reinforces a breadwinner-non-breadwinner divide, as the household means testing means that actually it's mainly the breadwinners who get the subsidy. And it's also part of the coercive approach by the state to make the unemployed take a low-wage paid job, as it is now topped up by the state. And that is happening with our universal credit system that's coming in. In the past, the unemployed could refuse a 0-hours contract. Now they are required to take it. So this leads to the fourth aspect, the revolutionising social protection through universal basic income. Now, the aim here is to end the coercive work-first approach by the state that's in my country and others is causing major problems for those people who are low-paid and poor. But my problem is I don't see any reason why the state should suddenly change permanently from being coercive to being a very benign state who will provide a decent basic income. It's also supposed to value all forms of work, including unpaid care work, but this I think this has the danger of reinforcing the gender division of labour and also encouraging employers to offer irregular and low-paid work as a top-up to the basic income. For some analysts, it empowers citizens, but I think this is only if it could be provided at a high level. And my own reading of the likelihood is that even if it's introduced at a high level, that doesn't stop a new government being elected and immediately reducing it again. So I'm very concerned about that. That doesn't mean I'm rejecting all arguments about using social protection to support people in precarious work. And I think we should, where we can, disconnect social protection from employment, but to stop short of a universal basic income. The UK has the only thing it's really proud of in its welfare system is its National Health Service. And I think this is a model that could be extended. I'm just reading about how a third of people in Greece have lost access to their health insurance due to the crisis. So health insurance is very risky. Denmark has a citizen's pension. That idea could be adopted elsewhere. Spain has a very innovative policy of giving much better access to maternity leave for those under 26, hardly requiring any employment record, but a recognition of the precarity of the youth labour market in Spain. Tony Atkinson proposed a universal basic income for children, which I think is an excellent idea for dealing with child poverty. So I think there are things we can learn without going down the universal basic income approach. So just to compare those four approaches, What I'm saying is we can reform the standard of employment relationship, and there is a large scope for greater inclusivity within existing systems, but there is a risk of more inclusive eligibility, but for lower benefits, which is a story that I haven't had time to elaborate. We can also reduce non-standard forms of employment by flexibilising access to the SER, and we've had some progress, but it's also characterised by some entrapment of women in these mommy tracks. We need flexibility at the point of hiring, and we need to do more about second chances. We can restrict impact through in-work credits, but I think this needs to be combined with major reforms, including restrictions on employers' rights to offer low-wage or irregular employment, more high-wage floors and guarantees of hours of work, so they can't take advantage of this by reducing their offer, and policies to make employers contribute to social protection. And finally, with respect to revolutionising the system, there is a strong case of basic incomes for pensioners and children, not linked to employment status of parents or their own past history, free access to healthcare, and ending coercion to take up irregular jobs and bad jobs. But I think the UBI example is too expensive, too risky, and likely to reinforce gender divide and the use of non-standard forms of employment. So to conclude, what I'm arguing here is, unfortunately, I have no simple story. There is no straight path towards inclusive labour markets. I think the growth in the non-standard forms of employment is a mixture of employer evasion of rights and protections, but also linked to restrictive access to the SER and the incompatibility between the way in which the standard employment relationship is organised and people's non-work commitments. Extending rights is not straightforward because we do have to take into account the risk of normalising and legitimising non-standard forms of employment. We can see that we have made some progress in extending social protection. I gave the example of France. I haven't had time. There are other examples. Certainly higher minimum social benefits is one feature of the 6 countries I was looking at. But there's less progress elsewhere. And I think the activation measures are even more problematic because they combine the costs of decommodification for the state with the cost of recommodification of work for workers and sanctions for workers. And the employers are somehow let off the hook. So I don't think it's time to abandon control of the employment relationship. The universal basic income solution does not solve either the welfare funding problem or the problem of recommodification of work. So again, I haven't really had time to develop these conclusions, but we also, in our project, looked at how we could actually use social dialogue to try and start to reduce precarious work. Alternative and new forms of social dialogue as well as traditional forms, and we need to do that. And we also need to build on good practices that we can find across different countries in how we improve eligibility and levels of benefits for those currently in non-standard forms of employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jill, for this. Now, there is no straight path, you say. Of course not. It's no easy way out here. You were not so keen on universal basic income, but you said more social dialogue, more good practices, good examples from other countries. Now, if you were a politician, what would be your first focus?
I think you have to define the country. In each country, the problem is different. So in my own country, I would do something very drastic about universal credit that's coming in, because I think it's making the workers responsible for finding up to 35 hours of work without any responsibility on the employers to provide that work. So in my country, that is where I would start. In Germany, I think I would start by having a minimum social benefit. I think the notion of, that women become more reliant on the household as a consequence of not providing that kind of minimum social benefit. It varies across countries. And
in
so
Sweden, what would you start with?
In Sweden is often the model of how it's yes, already there. So I think this is important issue. I think you've done many things, particularly this flexibilisation of the standard employment relationship, enabling people to reduce hours when they have childcare and then go back to full-time work if they want to. That is lacking in most countries, and I think that's an important thing. But of course, that does depend on, in a way, the job still being there. I think the problem is that if the jobs are allowed to become more flexible, it's going to be more and more difficult for maternity leave and these kind of things to work within an existing job. And so countries that are focusing more on long paid leaves might have to do more about childcare so that those who are self-employed have more support if they need to go back to work. And it's not a question of negotiating with a manager to say, I want to come, extend my leave. There's no manager, so they may have to go back to work to maintain their clients, and then they need more subsidised childcare. So I think we do have to take into account the way the labour market is changing in how we think about social welfare. But it obviously varies across countries.
So different actions in different countries. And as a researcher, where do you think more research is needed? In what area?
Well, I think this whole area of blurring the unemployment benefit and the in-work benefits is really interesting, and really changing the nature of what we think of what is job, what is employment, actually rethinking that. And obviously it links into the whole debate about new forms of work under new technologies. So I think these things are areas that we do have to look at. It doesn't mean that it's actually necessarily taking the, most of the work in the country, but as unless we address it while it's developing, we won't actually develop policies to actually remain inclusive, and there's increasing danger of the older system of employment and protection becoming more exclusive. So we do need to change and reform and look at those issues.
Thank you very much, Jill Rubery, for coming here. Thank you.